Here is something that nobody at any press briefing today has been willing to answer. Iran's foreign ministry confirmed this morning that Tehran will not be sending negotiators to Pakistan for the second round of talks. The ceasefire expires Wednesday, and the American delegation, led by the vice president, flanked by special envoys, flew to Islamabad anyway. They showed up to a meeting the other side publicly refused to attend. And China, the country whose oil purchases give Iran the economic oxygen to refuse, whose intelligence relationship helped guide Iranian strikes on American military bases, whose Security Council veto blocked every enforcement mechanism Washington wanted, China issued no meaningful statement about Iran's refusal, not a substantive word about the cargo ship America seized on Sunday after it traveled from China to Iran, not a call from the foreign minister pressing Tehran back to the table. Nothing. I want to spend the next 20 minutes explaining what that silence tells us, because China's nothing today is doing more work in this negotiation than anything Washington or Tehran has said out loud. And until you understand why, you will keep misreading every headline that comes next. Let me start with Iran's refusal, because the way the coverage is framing it is wrong, and understanding why it is wrong is essential to understanding what China is actually doing. Every outlet is treating Iran's refusal as stubbornness, as bad faith, as a country playing games with a ceasefire clock. The framing is, Iran is the problem. If Iran would just get on a plane, a deal could happen. That framing misses what Iran is actually doing. Iran's refusal is a strategic calculation, and the calculation is based on a very specific experience from round 1, 21 hours in Islamabad. The highest level direct engagement between the United States and Iran since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. The vice president and Iran's parliamentary speaker sitting across from each other, Pakistani mediators in the room, shuttling between positions, managing the temperature. And when it ended, Iran's chief negotiator said something whose exact words matter enormously. He said that before the negotiations began, his delegation came with good faith and will, but because of the experiences of 2 previous wars, they had no trust in the opposing side. Read that carefully. He is not describing a capability gap. He is not describing a military imbalance. He is describing a trust deficit. And to understand the depth of that deficit, you have to understand the specific ledger Iran is drawing on. America signed the Iran nuclear agreement in 2015. America tore it up in 2018. America announced this ceasefire and then, within days, imposed a naval blockade on Iranian ports inside the ceasefire window. America's president told reporters publicly that Iran had agreed to everything, that the enriched uranium was being transferred, that the deal was essentially done. Iran's foreign ministry went public within hours, calling those claims false and fabricated. Iran's chief diplomat said his country had been inches from a comprehensive agreement before American negotiators shifted the terms. One senior American source confirmed separately that the 2 sides had been roughly 80% of the way toward a deal, so Iran got to within 20% of the highest stakes agreement in decades. And then America moved the goalposts, and then on Sunday, an American guided missile destroyer spent 6 hours warning an Iranian cargo ship to stop, and when it didn't, opened fire with its main gun. Marines rappelled from helicopters onto the vessel's deck. The ship was in U.S. custody before the day was out. And America announced the whole episode on social media. The ship had been traveling from China to Iran. Iran's foreign minister called the seizure proof of American insincerity in diplomacy. Iranian state media called the second round of talks a media performance, a blame assignment exercise, not a genuine attempt at resolution. That is not stubbornness. That is a country that has learned from 2 broken nuclear agreements and nearly 2 months of active conflict exactly how much American words are worth when the cameras are off. There is something else in Iran's refusal that the coverage is missing almost entirely. The Iran you are watching in these news cycles is not one Iran, it is 2. There is the Iran of the foreign minister, the diplomat, the negotiator, the man who flew to Islamabad for 21 hours and who publicly announced that the Strait of Hormuz was fully open, that Iran wants to negotiate. It knows the blockade is real. It knows that if the ceasefire collapses Wednesday and bombing resumes, the phase that follows will be harder to survive than anything that came before. And there is the Iran of the Revolutionary Guard, the hardliners who overruled the foreign minister within hours of his Hormuz announcement, who sent gunboats to fire on tankers the very next day, who issued the formal retaliation statement after Sunday's cargo ship seizure. These two Irans are genuinely in conflict about how to handle this moment, and that internal disagreement matters because America is trying to make a deal with one Iran while the other Iran keeps firing on ships. The contradiction between the foreign ministry's public no on talks and a parliamentary security official simultaneously telling a regional broadcaster that a delegation would likely travel today or tomorrow. That is not noise. That is the sound of two competing power centers in Tehran fighting the same internal argument in real time. Now let me explain what China knew before it decided to say nothing meaningful. China has been the most consequential external actor in this conflict, not through force, not through public declarations, through three specific things it has done quietly and consistently since the fighting began. First, China has kept Iran economically alive. Before this war, Iran was exporting approximately 1.5 million barrels of oil per day. During the most intense weeks of the conflict, with the strait largely closed, American bombing at its peak, and the supreme leader gone, Iran was still exporting well over 1 million barrels per day, all of it going to China, a country whose nuclear facilities were bombed, whose air defenses were degraded, whose civilian economy was under maximum pressure. That country continued to move oil through the blockade because China kept buying. The mechanism is a system of vessels operating with falsified transponders, flags registered to landlocked nations, ship-to-ship cargo transfers in Malaysian waters, and payments processed through smaller Chinese financial institutions outside the international payments network entirely. China's official customs records show effectively zero imports from Iran, but China's recorded imports of what is listed as Malaysian crude run to a level that is more than double Malaysia's entire national oil production. The math does not reconcile unless the oil is coming from somewhere else. Nearly all Iranian tankers now at sea are heading to Chinese ports, not despite the blockade, but through the gap the blockade was written to leave open, and that gap is not accidental. America announced publicly that it would interdict every vessel in international waters that had paid a toll to Iran. But the operational language issued by the military command said something different. Ships transiting toward non-Iranian ports would not be impeded. A tanker loading at Iran's main export terminal and sailing to a Chinese refinery is technically going from an Iranian port to a non-Iranian port. Under that operational language, no interception is required. The gap between what was announced and what was implemented is not a drafting error. It is a deliberate choice. Someone decided that stopping a Chinese state-owned vessel in international waters is not an Iran problem. It is a China problem. And a China problem is an entirely different category of geopolitical event that America is not prepared to open right now. Second, China has kept Iran diplomatically insulated. When America proposed a United Nations Security Council resolution that would have authorized international force to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, China and Russia vetoed it. Not one ally joined America's naval blockade. Not one. China's foreign minister made 26 phone calls during the course of the war, with Iran consistently on the contact list. China and Pakistan jointly published a 5-point peace initiative. China cast itself publicly as a force for de-escalation while declining at every juncture to do anything that would actually weaken Iran's position. Third, China provided intelligence capability that directly benefited Iran on the battlefield. The Financial Times published a report based on leaked documents showing that Iran's Revolutionary Guard covertly acquired a Chinese commercial satellite in late 2024. The satellite was built by a Beijing-based firm with documented ties to Chinese universities known to work with the People's Liberation Army. The Guard's aerospace division, not Iran's civilian space program, controlled the satellite. Under a deal denominated in Chinese currency, Iran's military received not just the satellite but the ground infrastructure and software needed to direct it from anywhere on Earth. The satellite captured imagery of Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia during the same days that American aircraft at that base were struck and damaged. It monitored Muwafaq Salti Air Base in Jordan and locations near the American naval base in Bahrain around the timing of Iranian strikes on those facilities. The Financial Times reported this from leaked documents. Reuters reported it with independent official confirmation from American government sources. China denied the account, as it consistently denies all such accounts. The denial does not change what the documents show. So, China's oil purchases gave Iran the economic capacity to sustain the war. China's diplomatic positioning gave Iran the international cover to resist American pressure, and a Chinese satellite appears to have helped Iran see where American forces were so Iranian missiles could find those places more precisely. Now let me explain why China's silence on the Tuska, after all of that, is not passive. It is an active choice. China's foreign ministry holds a press conference every business day. The cargo ship seizure happened Sunday. By Monday, every major news organization had confirmed that the vessel had traveled from a Chinese port. If China wanted to issue a substantive response, the mechanism existed and the moment was obvious. What China actually said was a few sentences urging all parties to show restraint and avoid escalation. General language. Language with no specificity about the vessel, no acknowledgement of the ship's voyage from China, no demand for its release, and no pressure on Iran to return to the table. Iran is reading that calibrated silence with precision. Here is what Tehran reads in that sequence. China's last concrete diplomatic action was pressing Iran to announce the Strait open. Iran made that announcement. America kept the blockade. Iran reimposed restrictions. The Revolutionary Guard fired on tankers. America seized a ship that had just come from China, and China said nothing meaningful. Iran reads that as structural permission, not explicit permission. The permission that comes from a partner who is still buying your oil, still blocking United Nations resolutions, still providing the economic oxygen you need to refuse a meeting, and who has calculated that staying quiet costs China less than speaking. Consider what speaking would require. If China's foreign minister issues a specific statement about the seized ship, calling on America to release an Iranian vessel that had just come from a Chinese port, China publicly acknowledges that the voyage served Chinese interests. That opens questions about the cargo. It opens questions about the network. It opens questions that Beijing has no interest in answering. If China's foreign minister calls Tehran and presses Iran back to the table, China accepts accountability for whatever Iran does next, including walking away from any agreement China helped broker. China does not want that accountability. China wants credit for any eventual deal without accountability for Iran's behavior in the interval. So China calculates the cost of speaking against the cost of staying silent and stays silent, and Iran reads that calculation precisely. Our principal partner has determined that our refusal is acceptable. We can afford to stay home. Here is the structural reason China's silence serves China better than pressing Iran toward a clean agreement. If Iran signs a comprehensive deal, one that ends the war, reopens the strait on American terms, includes nuclear constraints, and produces sanctions relief, Iran becomes less dependent on Chinese buyers. A post-agreement Iran with access to international markets does not need to sell crude at a deep discount to Chinese refineries. China loses the privileged position it has built over a decade as Iran's sole significant customer. America emerges having demonstrated that its pressure toolkit can produce a nuclear deal, and the energy disruption that has been benefiting Chinese industry ends. The current state of this conflict, extended, inconclusive, expensive for America, profitable for China, is better for China than a clean American victory on American terms. Every week the war continues without resolution is a week in which Chinese refineries are buying Iranian oil at a discount, American military resources are stretched across the Middle East, and the global energy disruption that has accelerated demand for Chinese renewable technology and vehicles continues. There is one more dimension that explains the specific calibration of China's silence this week. The Trump-Xi summit in Beijing is scheduled for May 14th. Trump is traveling to Beijing. Trade, technology, Taiwan, the entire architecture of the U.S.-China relationship is built around that meeting. Every decision Beijing makes between now and May 14th is weighed against whether it makes that summit harder or easier. Issuing a formal protest about the seized cargo ship, a ship that had just come from China, forces Trump to respond publicly to Chinese interference in his own blockade enforcement. It creates a diplomatic incident before Air Force One lands in Beijing. China will not do that, not for one cargo ship. The summit is worth more than the protest. Now let me steelman America's position because I want you to test this analysis, not just accept it. America's argument is that the pressure is working. The blockade has turned back more than 24 ships. Iran's currency has lost significant value against the dollar since the blockade began. Iran's central bank has internally warned of a multi-year economic recovery timeline if the conflict continues. Iran came to Islamabad with a 70-member delegation after publicly rejecting talks. The parties got to within striking distance of a framework before negotiations stalled. And the Lebanon ceasefire, however fragile, removed one of Tehran's stated preconditions for meaningful talks. The internal contradiction inside Iran's own government today is real and significant. While the foreign ministry spokesperson said publicly there were no plans for a next round, an Iranian parliamentary official told a regional broadcaster that a delegation would likely travel today or tomorrow. These are not two journalists speculating. These are two officials from within the same government giving opposite answers on the same day. Iran rejected round one publicly before it happened, then sent a large delegation. The public rejection may be positioning, not a final decision. The steelman goes further. The vice president flying to Pakistan even after Iran's public refusal is not desperation. It is a deliberate signal to every mediating country, Pakistan, Egypt, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, that America is the party that showed up. If no deal is reached and the ceasefire expires, the world will have seen which side refused to come to the table. That diplomatic positioning matters. It shapes the international narrative heading into whatever comes after Wednesday, whether that is an extension, a resumption of strikes, or a third round. Pakistan's army chief flew to Tehran and was met at the tarmac with a genuine embrace from Iran's foreign minister. That warmth is not theater. It is the signal of a relationship being actively maintained because both sides want the channel to stay open, and Iran's foreign minister describing the seizure as proof of America's lack of seriousness, specifically seriousness in diplomacy, not in war, is the language of a negotiator who is still positioning for a deal, not the language of a government that has closed the door. That steelman is coherent. The pressure is real. The contradictions inside Iran's government are real. A deal before Wednesday, while structurally improbable, is not structurally impossible. But here is what the steelman cannot answer. Every round of pressure has produced movement, up to a point, and then it stalls, because the point at which Iran cannot absorb more pressure is further out than America's tools can reach. As long as China is buying Iranian oil through a system that was specifically engineered to be unreachable by American sanctions and blockades, Iran has what it needs to refuse, not comfort. Oxygen. Enough to call the talks a media performance. Enough to fire on tankers one day and insist on diplomatic respect the next. Enough to absorb the seizure of one cargo ship and vow retaliation without flinching. America's pressure strategy is trying to squeeze a country that has a lifeline America cannot cut. And the country holding that lifeline today issued no meaningful statement about the ship that was coming from its port when America cut it. Let me close with 3 specific signals to watch before Wednesday, because the sequence in the next 48 hours will tell you more than any press briefing. The first signal is whether China says anything specific about the seized cargo ship, not general language about de-escalation. China has been issuing that language for weeks. Something specific about a vessel that traveled from a Chinese port being seized by an American warship. If China stays silent on the specifics, that is Beijing calculating that ambiguity still serves it better than a direct response. If China speaks with specificity, it tells you that the seizure of a ship with direct China connections crossed a threshold that even the current calculus cannot quietly absorb. Watch not what China volunteers, watch what China says when asked directly. The answer, or the careful non-answer, is itself a precise signal about where Beijing's calculation currently sits. The second signal is whether China's foreign minister calls Tehran before Wednesday. His last confirmed call was several days ago. He pressed Iran to open the strait. Iran opened it, then closed it within 36 hours. A new call before Wednesday would signal that China has decided a deal, now serves it better than continued stalemate. It would mean Beijing has concluded that the ceasefire expiring, bombing resuming, and oil markets destabilizing creates costs that exceed the strategic benefits of the current extended impasse, including, critically, costs to the atmosphere surrounding the May summit. If China stays silent through Wednesday without a new call, that is Beijing deciding the current state is preferable to the outcome of a deal on America's current terms. The third signal is what Iran's actual delegation does and not what its foreign ministry says. The contradiction between the official no plans and the parliamentary officials today or tomorrow is not confusion. It is information about which faction inside Iran is winning the internal argument right now. If a delegation arrives in Islamabad despite the official statement, the diplomatic faction won that argument. The back channel with Pakistan produced something the press briefings cannot capture. If no delegation arrives by Tuesday, the hardliners won. The ceasefire expires Wednesday with no agreement in sight, and America faces a choice it has been deferring for nearly 8 weeks. Push back on this if you see it differently. Read the reports on China's muted response to the blockade. Read the Financial Times on the satellite targeting. Read the accounts from inside the first round of talks, especially Ghalibaf's words about trust being the deficit, not capability. Trust. And then ask the question that no press briefing today has asked. China's last concrete move was pressing Iran to open the Strait of Hormuz. Since then, America kept the blockade, seized a ship that came from China, Iran vowed retaliation, and the ceasefire is 2 days from expiring, and China said nothing. If Iran is reading that silence, and Iran is, then China's nothing is doing more work in this negotiation today than anything Washington or Tehran has said out loud.